Hi class, in this recording we're going to focus on how your biological sex is determined, your anatomy, whether you have the male anatomy, the female anatomy, or whether you have something that's kind of in between, whether you have the ambiguous genitalia. So let's dive into it. Let's just review a little bit at first. As we look at our reproductive system and the anatomy for the male and female sex organs, we have primary and secondary sex organs. The primary sex organs are going to make the gametes. So we have sperm for the male gamete and then eggs for the female gamete. And those gametes are going to be produced by the gonads. So gonads are the primary sex organ. That's kind of a generic term. The male gonad is a testy. The female gonad is an ovary. And the testy makes the sperm, ovary makes the egg. And we'll talk more about eggs versus secondary oocytes in a separate discussion. Right now, we're just going to call them eggs for the sake of simplicity. As we look at secondary sex organs, these are organs that are necessary for reproduction, but they aren't necessarily going to make the gametes directly. So within the male anatomy, we have some tubes, a system of ducts to move the sperm and semen. We have glands to contribute to the semen. And then we have the penis as the method of physically delivering the sperm cells or delivering the semen into the female's reproductive tract. On the female end of the spectrum, we have the uterine tubes, formerly known as the fallopian tubes, that carry the oocyte or the egg to the uterus, where it can implant. We have a vagina to receive sperm from the male's reproductive system, and we also have that uterus to help with the harboring of the fetus that's developing. As we look at internal versus external genitalia, external genitalia are, well, as the name implies, they're on the outside genitals that you can see. They are externally visible. And the only exceptions are going to be some accessory glands of the female peritoneum region. These external genitalia are going to be located in the peritoneum, that area in between your legs. And then we have internal genitalia. These internal genitalia are going to be located within the pelvic cavity. And all internal genitalia, with the exception of testes in males and a few of the ducts within the scrotum of the male anatomy, are going to be within that pelvic cavity. Now, as we look at secondary sex characteristics, these are how most of us are going to determine if we're looking at a male or a female. And I say that because most of the time, most people are wearing pants when you look at them. So you can't necessarily see what their external genitalia are, and I certainly hope at least you can't see their internal genitalia. So we have been trained to look at secondary sex characteristics. So we can determine if we're looking at a male or a female. And, there's also something to be said for preference. Some people prefer their certain physical secondary characteristics in their partner, and they find those characteristics to be more attractive than other characteristics. So let's look at both sexes. And we're talking biological sexes here. So male and female that are of a reproductive age or post-pubescent are going to have pubic hair and axillary hair. And they're also going to have activation of their apocrine sweat glands. So the associated scent glands are going to be kind of stinky. Also, both male and females, those two sexes, are going to have an increase in androgens, so the pitch of their voice is going to drop. Generally speaking, males, for a secondary sex characteristic, are going to have more androgens present in their blood, higher androgen concentrations relative to females, so males will have a lower voice than females, generally speaking. Males also are going to have more facial hair. They are also going to have much more coarser and visible body hair on their torso and limbs, and they're generally speaking going to have a relatively larger proportion of skeletal muscle mass compared to the female. The female end of the spectrum, though, is going to find that the distribution of body fat changes as they reach puberty and become post-pubescent. More body fat will be deposited around the side of the hips. There's also going to be more body fat deposited within the breast as the mammary gland enlarges. And generally speaking, females that are post-pubescent aren't going to have lots of coarse, visible body hair. They appear to be relatively hairless, even though they are still covered with fine white hairs. As we look at this idea of having two biological sexes, this process of having sex requires two parents. It's biparental, meaning that we need to get genes from mom and dad, the two parents. And our offspring, and yes, now that we have lots of genetic engineering, there are exceptions. We're talking about what naturally occurs in nature right now. And as we look at these offspring, the offspring aren't going to be genetically identical to either parent. They're going to be genetically similar to both, but identical to none. And when we die, so when you and I die, you and I kick the bucket. However, our genes can be carried on in the next generation. And this is a way for us, in a way, to be kind of immortal because our genomes can go on and continue to be perpetuated. Now, as we look at this process of reproduction sexually, we need to have gametes, sex cells, that are made by each parent. Mom makes eggs, dad makes sperm. And when you take an egg and a sperm and combine them together, you have a zygote. And this zygote is when you have a brand new combination of genes from mom and dad. So as we look at every human walking around on this planet, we all started out as a single-celled zygote with a unique combination of chromosomes from mom and dad. That zygote has often been referred to commonly as the fertilized egg in colloquial speech. Now, as we look at male and female gametes, the male gamete needs to have the ability to move. It needs to have motility. The male gamete is commonly referred to as a sperm. Technically, it's referred to as a spermatozoon. A spermatozoon is going to be produced by males. So by definition, if you make the sperm, you are going to be considered the male parent. Generally speaking, and there are always going to be a couple of exceptions, but generally speaking, if you have the male biology, you are going to have a Y chromosome. And within that Y chromosome, there's a special area called the SRY region that is going to be responsible for the development of the male characteristics, the male phenotypes. As we look at the other gamete, the female gamete, that is known as the egg. Technically, the eggs are referred to as ovum. And if you are an individual that produces the ovum, the egg, you are by definition going to be considered biologically female. And generally speaking, and we'll talk about these exceptions in this presentation, not this specific recording, but generally speaking, if you don't have the Y chromosome, you're going to be an XX for the sex chromosomes. And if you're an XX, you are going to be female. And as we look at mammals, another thing that's unique to mammals, and we as human beings are mammals, is that overwhelmingly the female is going to provide uterine development. We're going to have some kind of sheltered internal environment. I suppose there's marsupials that don't necessarily have a lot of uterine development, but we as human beings have lots and lots of uterine development. And within that internal environment, within that uterus, we give lots of prenatal nutrition of the developing embryo that's growing inside of the mother. As we look at males, the male reproductive system is going to be twofold. It's going to make sperm and then deliver the sperm. So it's production and delivery. Males make the sperm and then introduce the sperm into the female's reproductive tract. When the penis is erect and the male copulates or ejaculates with their penis, they are going to send sperm into the female's reproductive tract. As you look at the female reproductive tract, it is also twofold. I would say three or fourfold. It's much more complicated than male's reproductive tract. Males are, generally speaking, pretty easy to understand when it comes to a reproductive perspective. Females, though, need to make an egg. They need to receive the sperm. They need to introduce the eggs and sperm to each other, the egg and sperm to each other. Then they need to develop and harbor the fetus, and they need to, after the child has been born, postpartum, they need to be able to provide milk or nourishment to that child. So when we look at the female reproductive system, it has a lot more functions and it's a lot more complicated than the male reproductive system. Females also have a copulatory organ, just like males. except instead of having a penis, females, generally speaking, will have vaginas for receiving the sperm from the male reproductive system. As we look at sex determination, males are going to have, generally speaking, Y chromosomes. And on that Y chromosome, they have the sex determining region, or SRY region. And if this segment of genes, or this region of genes is present, it's going to activate and dictate the development of a male phenotype. It's possible to have the male phenotype without a Y chromosome, and we'll talk about that in a later recording. It's worth emphasizing, though, that the other Y chromosomal genes are also needed for a thriving male. So while you can have a male phenotype without a Y chromosome, the Y chromosome has other genes present on it that are needed for a thriving, vibrant male that's capable or has a high probability of reproducing. So here we look at a generic chromosome, generic Y chromosome. That SRY region is going to be present on the short arm of the Y chromosome. As we look at the XX individuals that have an SRY region, these are typically going to represent or present themselves as males, so they'll be the male phenotype, but they're going to be completely sterile, and they have a very effeminate appearance. And if you want to read more about it, I included the DOI link right down there. You can download this presentation and click on the link, or you could manually type in the DOI number into a search engine. So there are some weird things that may happen, but this being an XX individual with the XX sex chromosomes, but it having an SRY region from crossing over is not very common, but it does happen occasionally. As we look at some of the other exceptions that happen, we have XXY or triple X, XXXY. These individuals that have an X chromosome and more, excuse me, a Y chromosome and more than one X chromosome are known as having Klinefelter syndrome. And here's a photograph of an individual that has Klinefelter syndrome. Individuals that have Klinefelter syndrome, generally speaking, are going to represent 1 in 800 births. So we're looking at about a little bit more than 1/10 of 1% of the population having this syndrome, and I should say 1/10 of the males. In terms of the binary biological sexes that are presented, these individuals present as a male phenotype because they have the SRY region from that Y chromosome present. In terms of cognitive development, there's nothing really abnormal. They're very cognitively average if they have only 2 X's, but if they are a triple X, if they have 3 X's plus a Y, generally speaking, there's going to be some cognitive deficits within these individuals. If somebody is just a triple X with no Y chromosomes, this is going to represent 1/10 of the percent of births, or 1 in 1,000 births. These are represented by fertile females, and these females have a slightly older appearance. So as we look at these females, they are physically larger, they physically look like they're older than they really are, and cognitively, they are average. So they typically aren't going to have higher than average IQs. Many individuals that have triple X syndrome are never diagnosed with triple X syndrome because, other than just looking a little bit old for their age, that's the only thing that's abnormal about those individuals. As we look at individuals that have an XYY, so they have 2 Y chromosomes, that's represented or known as Jacob syndrome. And here is an individual with Jacob syndrome on the right, next to an individual that is just an XY, that does not have Jacob syndrome on the left. This represents about 1 in 1,000 births. These males are physically much taller than average. Cognitively, there's no noticeable defects. However, these individuals are almost always going to be sterile in nature. If you see somebody that just is very, very tall, it may be that that male that biological male has Jacobs syndrome, but in most situations, these individuals are never diagnosed with Jacobs syndrome unless they're trying hard to have a child and they go in for fertility testing to figure out what may be wrong, why they aren't able to reproduce with their sexual partner. As we look at individuals that have that standard XY chromosome configuration for the sex chromosomes, that's your standard pairing for males. However, you can have an XY chromosome and the SRY region of the Y chromosome, but if you don't have the ability to respond to male sex hormones, if you are androgen insensitive, biologically, phenotypically, you can develop as a female even though you have male genetics. The most famous example of this is Jamie Lee Curtis. And she is an example of somebody who has complete androgen insensitivity. And when somebody has complete androgen insensitivity, even though they have male genetics, they have the female phenotype and they grow up biologically presenting as a female. Individuals that are androgen insensitive have some perks to it. They typically are going to develop female and assume they're female their entire lifespan until they hit puberty, and then they notice some things don't go quite right when they hit puberty. But these individuals, since they can't respond to androgens, generally speaking, don't have a lot of body hair, and when they're teenagers, or think of that time when you're in middle school, they have hardly any acne associated, as they're developing in middle school and those awkward early teenage years. And speaking as somebody who had horrible acne, that would have been nice because, yeah, acne was no fun. We also are going to have partial androgen insensitivity. The partial androgen insensitivity is going to be represented as hermaphroditism. And these hermaphroditism examples are numerous. There's a spectrum of hermaphroditism. In terms of how frequent androgen insensitivity is, it represents about 1 in 20,000 births. So it's not very common. As we look at partial androgen insensitivity, there are multiple phenotypes that have been identified. So shown here are the genitals of multiple variations of androgen insensitivity based on specific mutations to the androgen receptor gene within the body. So we can have complete androgen insensitivity, which is going to be represented by phenotypically developing as a biological female, or we have partial androgen insensitivity, which phenotypically is represented as developing as having ambiguous genitalia, or a blending of male and female genitalia. And that's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the two biological sexes, please feel free to post them on the class discussion board or to shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.